is it definitely decided that you're going to be going to jail, or is there going to be possibly a fine, or what?
Well, I go back to court on October 30th. At that time, there will be a sentence directed. The maximum would be 8 months in jail and a fine. However, whatever the sentence would be, even if it was suspended and there was a probation of some kind, we would still go ahead and appeal the conviction.
Which means that you would not go to jail during that period.
You see, the two misdemeanors I was convicted on, the one, public profanity, could be very easily done away with, because the Supreme Court has recently ruled that in a theatrical performance, and not just theatrical performances, but in most other situations, the First Amendment guarantees freedom of expression, and that conviction would automatically be held unconstitutional. The exposure charge, we're maintaining innocence, and since the prosecution didn't come up with any real proof, we just appeal it and take it to a higher court. So I wouldn't go into jail immediately, I don't think.
I would hope not.
Me too.
Did you see that thing in Rolling Stone where they had the reprint from some newspaper?
No.
Where they had the testimony of some guy who said something about you making indecent exposure, and then they made a misprint, and they had a recipe for some sauce.
Right, I saw that when I was down there.
That was really nice.
There was a thing in the Village Voice that was hysterical.
It was a very interesting trial. It really was. I'd never seen the judicial system in action, the progress of a trial from the first day to the last, and I had to be there for every day, being the defendant, and it was fascinating, very educational.
Jim Morrison and the Doors got into trouble because of what happened at their Miami concert for a few reasons, but maybe something that people don't realize, especially now because that kind of behavior on stage has become more prevalent in our times, is, first of all, in the context of his time, it was more shocking than it is now, but also the Doors were a much bigger target than, say, Iggy Pop of the Stooges, who was doing stuff that I would consider to be much more objectionable if you're going to impose morality on something, cutting yourself in front of an audience. If, as some people have said, the establishment were really looking for targets, and I believe they were at that time, Jim Morrison made a great one because he had, to be honest, made himself a target by what he did in Miami, whether he exposed himself or not, but also because he was so well known at that point and the Doors were so well known. That's what I think was really at the heart of Jim Morrison. It wasn't because he exposed himself on stage. I mean, and if he did, hardly anybody would have seen it anyway. I mean, it was just ridiculous. It was really trying to put a nail in the coffin of the counterculture, if that was even possible, which it wasn't. So the whole thing was a ridiculous tragedy, in my view.
I think he knew from the first that he was doomed. We talked about it a little, obviously, when we were, alone together, and we discussed it quite a bit, and he just said, "They're out to hang me." And I said, "Yeah, they kind of are." And he said, "I'm not going to get off." And I said, "No, you're not," and I think he got off on the worst of the felony counts, but he did get indicted and convicted on a bunch of other ones, which I think would have resulted something like 6 months in the Dade County Slammer. So there was that. But he knew from the first that he was not going to get through it. Nobody here gets out alive. And I think what he had resolved in his head was that A, nobody was going to see how upset he was, and B, he was going to try to do it as much as possible on his own terms.
He wants to kill me so bad he can taste it.
How can I always going to kill him?
Attica! 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 Attica!
Good evening. The 4-day insurrection at New York's Attica State Prison came to a tragic end this morning. Negotiations gave way to force, making this the bloodiest prison incident the country has seen in 4 decades.
In the final hours of the revolt, led primarily by blacks, the inmates murdered 9 of their white hostages. 28 convicts were killed by state troopers and sheriff's deputies who regained control of the prison.
Prison officials told the press that the hostages were killed by prisoners who slit their throats. But they lied. Everyone who died that day was killed by state gunfire.
Officials at the prison said 8 of the hostages had had their throats cut. But today, the Monroe County medical examiner, having looked at the bodies, said no throats were cut at all. The medical examiner says the hostages were apparently killed by large caliber ammunition and shotgun blasts from a distance, which immediately raised the possibility that some of the hostages may in fact have been shot down by the lawmen who broke in to rescue them.
I was sentenced at Attica for a robbery in 1966. Attica was a nightmare. Conditions, overcrowded. The guards, they were vicious. The prison ran on anger. It ran on fright. We heard that a prisoner was killed by guards in another prison. It wasn't planned, it was spontaneous.
The national mood of political unrest and protest filtered into the United States prison system. And on September 9th, 1971, prisoners at Attica Correctional Facility seized control of the prison. The prisoners took hostages and demanded better living conditions.
And the entire prison was taken over. And 1,289 inmates took over D Yard, which is one of the 4 exercise yards at Attica.
All of you that say you're politically oriented.
They have a list of what they call practical demands. Just about every one of them have to do with the improvement of prison conditions. This is not a riot of prisoners who are seeking to escape. It is a riot of prisoners who are eminently practical and who are spelling out conditions which they feel should be improved.
We want to apply the New York State minimum wage law to all state institutions. We want to stop to slave labor here. We want to allow all New York State prisoners to be politically active without intimidation or reprisals. We want true religious sanctity. We want to do our own thing in this place. Number 4, in all censorship of newspapers, magazines, letters, and other publications coming from the publisher.
Things changed. It became more serious.
10:05 a.m. September 13th. We're on the roof of A block, waiting for the assault to begin. The hostages are on the catwalks with knives at their throats.
What did the guard tell you? He said he had just received orders that no one but uniformed personnel would be permitted in. Why do you think that they're not letting you in, Mr. Counselor? I think they're killing people.
White power!
450 people fired over 4,500 rounds of ammunition.
So what did actually happen at that infamous Doors concert back in 1969? Artisan News caught up with Robbie Krieger, lead guitarist of the Doors, recently to get his thoughts on what a sham Jim's arrest was and what he remembers about that particular performance.
You know, it was a sham, man. The whole thing was ridiculous. It was, you know, nothing happened that night after we played. That we were having beers with the cops, you know, after the show, and it wasn't until a week later when some politicians who were trying to make a name for themselves decided to make a big deal about the show and charged Jim with all this stuff. Most of which he did, but the one thing he didn't do was to whip it out. He didn't do that. Otherwise, somebody would have took a picture of it. And there was 1,000 or so photographs entered into evidence, but none of them showed Jim whipping it out.
The movie will begin in 5 moments.